Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. What is the state of the economy today? How badly damaged is it both by the virus and the lockdown? And what additional steps are needed to remedy and rectify matters? Those are three critical issues that I shall raise today with the Director of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy and a former member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Rathin Roy. Dr. Roy, let's start with the state of the economy today. And let's take that, in fact, in two parts. First, there is a view that in June we saw green shoots emerging because of improvements in electricity generation, consumption of petroleum products, and an increase in revenue earning freight traffic on the railways. Alongside this, there were also reasonable rebounds in FMCG, tractor, and two-wheeler sales. Do you agree with that view, or do you think it's somewhat exaggerated?
I have learned, Karan, in my training to do two things. One, never ever draw any conclusions from a single data point. Two, ignore anyone who talks about green shoots, because that has become a metaphor for aspiration. This is the fifth or sixth time I'm hearing the word green shoots in the last 5 years. On the precise question of where the economy is going, therefore, I do not think it would be prudent or wise to conclude anything from a month's data, a single data point. The fact remains that the economy has been under lockdown. The fact remains that demand has shrunk. The fact remains that services are still operating well below capacity, both because they're unable to and because consumers of services, which is over half our economy, are unwilling to go out there and buy them or purchase them. Look at my head. I every day wrestle with the question of whether I should actually go to my barber or not. And so far my answer has been no.
In a very way, you've answered my second question, but let me nonetheless put it to you. The Economic Times reports that whatever sense of growth was apparent in June has lost its momentum in July because of the lockdowns that we've seen in Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, Bangalore, Patna, Pune. In fact, Mahesh Vyas, the CEO of the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, has actually said, and I quote, "Data of the first 2 weeks of July suggest that the recovery has stopped progressing beyond its level of the last 2 weeks of June." I know you don't believe there's been any significant growth in June, but whatever there was, has that also tapered off in July?
Look, again, I must caution your readers. People who are drawing conclusions from single data points are not doing what you should be doing professionally. So I don't know whether the economy grew in June or not, and frankly, it doesn't matter. I don't know if the economy declined relative to June in July or not, and frankly, it doesn't matter. The question is that will sustained economic recovery happen, and to what extent will it happen across the year? And you simply cannot conclude in this breathless fashion from one data point here and one data point there.
In which case, would you say that the state of the economy today is not substantially, measurably different to what it was in May?
The state of the economy after March is substantially worse than it was expected to be before March. That is the only professional conclusion I can draw. How worse? I'm afraid this knee-jerk going to what you do in business as usual, which is comparing past data with current data, is not going to work, because this pandemic is a disaster that has made comparisons with the past irrelevant and unsuitable. So we have to deploy what I call inductive logic, which one of your guests on the show, Pranav Singh, deployed rather well, and ask, on the basis of information we have today, to what extent can we think about what is going to happen to the economy in the course of this year, March to February?
I'll come to that in a moment's time. Let me raise with you two things that do stand out. One is, and many think it's a bit discordant, the recent CPI inflation figure, consumer inflation, retail inflation. It's the first figure released since the lockdown, and it's come in at 6.1%. Now, as you said, demand has shrunk very considerably. How then do we explain inflation at 6.1%?
Demand has shrunk and supply has shrunk. And a single data point only tells you it is quite conceivable that in sectors where supply has shrunk, the remaining demand is only being met at higher prices. And that could be for a variety of temporary reasons. Again, the past is not a guide to current analysis. Let me give you an example. If a business decides that they can only sell, let's say, 100 television sets in a week, when they could earlier sell 1,000. And if they were selling 1,000 at 10,000 rupees, and to stay afloat selling 100 television sets, they will need to sell them at 14,000 rupees. And as a consequence of taking that business decision, they don't even sell 100, they sell 80. You would see a 40% increase in inflation in the case of television sets. It tells you absolutely nothing.
I understand. And therefore, the increase in inflation to 6.1% is a reflection both of shrunk demand, but also, and this most people have ignored, shrunken supplies. Let me put you a second.
It could be a combination of idiosyncratic factors, which are rational in the context of a particular business decision, taken at a particular point in time, to charge higher prices and sell less to survive.
Okay.
Not because supply has shrunk, because people cannot produce, that could be another reason, but because people have chosen to sell less at higher prices, and that is purely temporary. And therefore, to conclude anything from that would be wrong.
Let me put you a second area where people are a little surprised, this time rather pleasantly, and that is the fact that agriculture seems to be one part of the economy that is less affected by both the lockdown and the virus. After a bumper harvest in the Rabi season, the area under cultivation for kharif is said to be 44% more than next year. In fact, as a result, the agriculture minister is predicting that agricultural growth for the year as a whole will be 3%, which is only marginally less than last year's 3.7%. How do you explain this apparent resilience in agriculture?
No, I'm much more confident about the credibility of that data. Though with respect, I do not understand how the area under cultivation can go up by 44%, because that would mean that there was 44% area that could have been cultivated last year that was not cultivated last year. Something I find difficult to believe unless there are exceptional circumstances which an agricultural expert could tell me. But never mind. The main point here is this. It is correct that the successful harvesting of the Rabi crop and its successful marketing and financial measures taken by the government, state governments in particular, and the relative availability of labor one way or the other has permitted agricultural sector to complete sowing operations under favorable monsoon conditions. I would say that if community transmission does not extend to the rural areas at least before September, then we would have saved 80% of agricultural output. If the same continues for the next Rabi crop, then we will definitely have a growth in agricultural output. And if that agricultural output is sold at reasonable prices, that's very important, because the trouble with agriculture is when output rises, prices tend to fall. And therefore, the net impact on GDP gets nullified by the price fall. But if you're able to sell food, paradoxically, at the same prices, notwithstanding increased supply as we were able to sell it last year, then I expect agricultural growth to be positive across the board. Yeah.
When you say you expect agricultural growth to be positive, would you agree with the minister's prediction that it could be as much as 3%?
I am not an astrologer. I do not know where people are getting these numbers from. I am certain it is highly speculative. And I find it pointless. Because if I knew it was 3% or I chose to act on it, what would I do? The policy point here is this, that whatever harvest we get, and it is likely to be at least as good as last year, if not better, we must make sure, because GDP has two things to it, quantity and price. We must make sure that we provide enough price support so that that harvest is sold fully at prices which bring remuneration back to the farmer, thereby contributing both to GDP and to equity. That is the main question here. Whether it is 3% or 2%, frankly, is of no policy relevance.
Against this background, what do you believe will be the impact of the virus and the lockdown on growth during the year as a whole, assuming there is no further stimulus? Now, SBI, the State Bank of India, has estimated that the economy will shrink by 6.8%. The ratings agency ICRA says it could shrink by 9.5%. Pranab Sen, the former chief statistician, in the interview that I think you a moment ago referred to, an interview to The Wire, said he believed the economy could shrink by as much as 12.5%. What's your sense? What will be the level at which the economy this year as a whole will shrink?
Let me start by saying that you're referring to the real rate of growth,
Yes,
which is growth short of inflation. And frankly, I don't understand one question here, which is exactly how do people calculate the real rate of growth? Because as I understand it, the way you normally measure GDP growth is by measuring the nominal rate of growth, that is price times quantity, and then you deflate. So what deflator they're applying, I don't know. So I have done it in terms of nominal growth. And in terms of nominal growth, let me say, the economy will shrink. If I look at the supply side, the question I have asked is, to what extent will activity be restored, assuming demand comes back? You know, activity that was affected by the pandemic, to what extent will it be restored going forward across the year? And my answer, as I said to you, agriculture is at least 90%. With large manufacturing, I expect restoration capability to be 60 or 70%. With services, unfortunately, I do not expect it to be more than 50%. And I expect foreign trade to be suppressed. The current account surplus is not relevant to what we are speaking of. I'm happy to explain that later. Broadly, we are exporting much less and we are importing much less. So therefore, the total contribution of foreign trade to the economy is low. Now, that supply side shock alone would mean a fall in the nominal growth rate of somewhere between 14 and 7%.
14,
depending on how
I'm interrupting. Did you say 14 and 17%? I'm just clarifying.
Nominal. Now, depending on how you deflate it, 5%, 6%, 7%, you would get real growth rate falls of between 7 and 10%. Somewhere between what ICRA said, SBI said, and Pranab Sen said. They're all landing in the same rather broad range. Because it will be real growth, it's difficult for me to say how they're doing it. But this is a worst case scenario. If demand in the economy, if you look at the loss of income, then you say, okay, if income is lost, by how much will consumption go down? I've done that exercise. And by how much will investment go down? And what will happen to government spending? There are three sources of demand: private consumption, government spending, and private investment. I'm assuming that private investment will take some time to recover in a declining situation. To the extent that private consumption recovers as well as possible without a stimulus, and to the extent government is at least able to spend as a proportion of GDP what it was spending last year, I repeat, as a proportion of GDP, spend what it was spending last year, which is something between 12 and 13% of GDP nominally. I expect the demand shock to be somewhere around 14 or 15%. Now, the good news here is that normally what would happen is prices would react to clear the market. But what will happen here is the less the demand shock, the more supply will respond and the lower will be the hit. In the worst case scenario, the hit will be what I said. In the best case scenario, the hit could be as low as minus 12% nominal, which would then take us to the -5, -7 real growth rates that the analysts on the more optimistic side are speaking of. But the bottom line for your viewers is this. There is no way the Indian economy is going to expand as you have been used to seeing it expand across your lifetime. You are going to see for the first time in your lifetime, all of you, irrespective of your age, unless you're about 90, anyone below 90, the Indian economy contracting in nominal terms for the first time. And that's a very different world from the world you've been living in all your life.
Just to pick up and clarify for the audience so that they've understood that long answer, the worst case scenario, I'm starting with that, you're saying is a contraction of the nominal growth rate between 14 and 17%. If you assume that inflation is 6, just because that's what it was when it was announced last Monday, you're talking of a contraction that is somewhere between 8% and 11% in nominal terms. The best case scenario is a nominal contraction of 12%. Again, if you assume inflation is 6, that's a contraction of real growth of 6%. So we're talking in real growth terms of a contraction that varies between 6 at the best end and roughly 11, 12 at the bad end. Is that a correct summary of what you said?
That is correct.
Let me then ask you, what will be the impact on the poor and the vulnerable? A recent United Nations report said that between 2005-6 and 2015-16, India pulled 273 million people out of poverty. How many now are likely to be pushed back into poverty?
I would give my left arm to answer that question. Trouble is, these poverty numbers are all estimates and guesstimates. And we simply have not been measuring annually the number of poor people. That is one problem. Second problem is one that I must share with your readers. If you are not poor today, but just above the poverty line, the line that defines if you are poor or not, 4 people out of 10 who are just above the poverty line will fall back into poverty in normal times. And if you can pull more than 4 people out of 10 out of poverty, then you get a net gain in poverty reduction, right? I hope that's clear. The point I'm trying to make here is that this business of being poor and not poor in our country is very vulnerable. People are hugely vulnerable. Once you leave poverty, there's a long road you have to follow to be sure that you will not fall back into.
Can I interrupt?
One illness, yes.
Can I interrupt? You said that in normal times, 4 people of 10 tend to fall back into poverty. This is clearly not a normal time. This is a time when the distress that this group just hovering above poverty faces is greater than ever before. So how much bigger will be the number that will fall back into poverty?
It will be more than in normal times, I can tell you that. I don't know by how much.
But in other words, you're saying that in fact, a very sizable number of people who were pulled out of poverty and were hovering just above poverty will now be pushed back. We may not be able to put a precise number on it, but a sizable number of people will be pushed back into poverty.
No, that would depend on the extent to which those who were vulnerable, face distress that is greater than they normally would.
But aren't we assuming,
so, for instance,
aren't we assuming that the stress they face is greater than they normally would?
I cannot automatically assume that as a professional. Tell you why. So if I'm living in one of the poorest districts of India, say in Maharashtra or Bihar, I had stress, and there's a probability there that there's a 40% chance one illness in my family, some event pushes me back into poverty. But that stress may not be exacerbated because of COVID, because my life was pretty miserable anyway.
In other words,
so to that extent,
if I understand you correctly, you're saying we don't know how many people will be pushed back into poverty, and it may not be a large number because of COVID. There could be other reasons as well. COVID may not be the decisive factor, or the lockdown.
Correct.
Okay.
We simply don't know. I'm not saying it will not be. I'm not saying it will not be. I'm not saying it will be. I'm saying something that people are very loath to say. I don't know.
Okay, that's very clear. But what I think we can agree on is that chances are that the distress these people who are hovering above poverty will face will increase. Whether it's because of COVID and the lockdown, whether it's because of other reasons, we don't know. But whatever the reasons, chances are more than 4 out of 10 will be pushed back into poverty. More people than
it's not so much. It's not so much that.
It's not answer rather than an academic debate.
No. The academic debate is very important if you're going to ask questions that require this sort of precision. Otherwise, we get it wrong. And that is not a good thing. That's not a good place to be. It's a bit like saying that India has solved its current account balance because we have an export surplus. So on poverty, the way I would look at it is this. Those who are in poverty and were likely to get out of it, we know that an important driver of that is positive economic growth. We know, and please viewers notice, I'm using the word know very carefully. We know that we are not going to have positive growth this year. Therefore, we know that the rate of people who actually exit poverty, forget those who fall back into it, will necessarily have to be lower than if we had growth. That will be the main driver of an increase in poverty.
Okay.
On top of that, to the extent that this crisis and the lack of growth push people back into poverty, you will have a further increase in poverty. But the driver will be this. Growth of the economy has pulled people out of poverty. That growth is now going to turn negative, therefore fewer people will be pulled out of poverty, and on top of it, you might have others who fall back into poverty. Therefore, poverty will certainly increase relative to last year, but I tell you what, you won't have the data to measure it because these things are not measured annually.
I think long last we have an answer the audience can understand. Poverty will increase relative to last year. Fewer people will be pulled out of poverty. More will actually be pushed back into poverty, as a result of which poverty will increase. Let's move on. Now, taking all together everything that the government has done and announced, we have a recovery package of 20.9 lakh crore, but analysts have pointed out that the fiscal stimulus is just about 1 or 1.2% of GDP. Most of that package is collateral-free loans, credit guarantees, funding schemes. Increasingly now, economists and industrialists are demanding a greater fiscal stimulus. They're talking of a second fiscal package. First of all, do you believe there is need for greater fiscal stimulus?
Okay, let me explain this to your viewers. I'm sick of this word stimulus in this context. Let me ask your viewers something. If you're fallen into a deep hole and I need to get you out of that hole, do I poke you or prod you to make you jump? You see, the reason I'm saying this is, in a normal economy, what happens in normal times is that the economy goes down because animal spirits are affected, people become lethargic. So if you were lethargic and you had to run a race, maybe poking and prodding you or stimulating you with caffeine would make you run or move. This is not that situation. You're not running a race because you're fallen into a hole. That's what's happened to our economy. So what you need is support, not stimulus. I repeat, support. Now the question is, how do I support? You have many choices. What countries all over the world have done, especially rich ones, is that they have provided support by saying, because your economy has fallen into this hole of negative growth and this disaster, we will use public money to make sure that your incomes temporarily, to the extent we can afford it, do not suffer. We will also, like the UK Chancellor did.
Can I stop you there? Do we need similar measures like the UK? Rishi Sunak carried out a very extensive, and I would add a very expensive, income support mechanism. Up to 80% of all salaries at a maximum of £2,500 per month. Do we need something similar? Obviously, the figures will be different, but do we need that sort of direct income support?
You'll have to let me complete that, and then I will answer your question, because this is necessary to take your viewers through the analysis. So, one way I could do it, as you were saying, is provide income support. The other way I could do it is say that you're falling into a hole. Now, what is you? You are the economy. Government is not the economy. Now, to get out of this hole, you will need crutches, props, etc. to get you back on the road. So what I can do is make life easier for you in terms of easier credit to enable you to get out of this hole. And when you get out of this hole, then the people you employ, the things you buy, you begin to buy them again, and you're on the road to recovery. Unfortunately, those of you who have fallen into such a deep hole, many services, that you can't get out of it. I'm sorry, we are a poor country. We cannot afford more than the kind of credit support we are giving you to getting out. So if you burn, you burn.
Dr. Roy, Dr. Roy,
that is approach. So you have a choice between you have a choice between income support and a policy that provides credit generously and at attractive terms, suspending the rules. Once you have taken that choice, you can't have both. You are walking down that road, and that is the choice we have made. That we are going to provide support principally, we are going to provide relief to these Jan Dhan accounts for poor people, etc. And then the government has said we will make it easier for firms and producers to borrow so that they get back on their feet. And those who cannot get back even on these easy terms, well, that's a casualty of COVID, and we will have to live with it. That's, I think.
Forgive me, I am interrupting because I think it's important that clarity be given. You said there are two ways of providing support. One is income support, which is what the British did. The other is credit guarantees, collateral-free loans. We opted for the credit guarantee part, the credit-free loan part. And you're saying you can't switch between the two. Having done one, you can't now give income support. So are you saying now it's too late to consider greater fiscal support? We've already opted for credit guarantees and we need to continue down that route. Is that what you're saying?
Well, to answer your question, I need to know why the government took the decision that it did. And if, as I suspect, it took that decision not just ideologically, so that could be the case. Because ideologically, this is what a Thatcherite government would do, what we have done. There's no Thatcherite government anywhere in the world, but that is what we would do. But there is another reason the government could have done it. If you look at the track record of public service delivery and spending in India, other than simple things like transferring money into a bank account, which is very easy, it doesn't involve much bureaucratic act.
We're running out of time. Please speak to the point because otherwise we'll run out of time.
I am speaking to the point. But I have to elaborate because I can't both have brevity and explain to your readers clearly what is happening. So, one call that you might take is, given the appalling track record of government expenditure in the past, heavy lifting in the form of the kind of heavy income support that the UK did or Japan did is simply not feasible with such a weak state. Maybe the state governments could do it, but for its own reason, the centre has chosen to.
So are you saying the government made the right choice?
Therefore, they chose not to do it.
Are you saying the government made the right choice? Pushing credit guarantees and collateral-free loans and minimizing the fiscal stimulus. Are you saying that was the right?
That depends entirely on the faith that the government had in its own mechanisms.
Surely you have an opinion. I'm asking you your opinion. Is your opinion that the government made the right choice?
My opinion is that if the government felt that it was not capable of delivering income support, then it made the right choice. Whether I or you think that
academic, it's almost as if you're reluctant to answer the question directly, which is why you're doing it expansively and evasively. Let me ask you this. You know the state of the economy. You know what the government is capable of. You've been a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Was this government capable of greater income support in March, April, or May?
Absolutely, any government is, and this government was, if it changed its business as usual pattern of working.
If it
would have to do much more heavy lifting than it has been used to doing.
If it was capable of greater income support, then was it wrong not to make that support available?
If it was capable of greater income support and it had put in place to my satisfaction, and therefore the question is a counterfactual one, measures that showed that the income support would deliver the desired results, then income support would have been a good thing.
But then you're suggesting to me from the answer that it was capable of greater income support would have helped, therefore it should have given it, and was wrong not to do so.
I wish life were that simple, Karan. No. If the government was able to change the way it did business to become more effective than it historically has, then income support would have worked. So you did two things, a willingness to provide income support and a willingness to change the game. For example, if rates of delivery of NREGA and SSA, if the same rates of delivery affected income support schemes, a lot of the money would be wasted.
Let me
need to see a battle plan, and I did not see that battle plan. Therefore, I must conclude that the government decided it was not capable.
Let me cut through that and put to you what many believe was the reason why the government was reluctant to give a bigger fiscal stimulus than just the 1.2% of GDP. It's the fact that the fiscal deficit target set in the budget of 3.5 could have gone up to 7 or 8% levels, particularly if the sort of fiscal support recommended by Pranab Sen in the interview to me was forthcoming. He talked about at least 10 lakh crore more than the February budget. And now if you add to that the fact that revenue this year could fall short, the fiscal deficit could be reaching 9 and 10%. And the government felt this would lead to a ratings downgrade, and that would be damaging for India's standing. Do you accept that if the reluctance was to do with the fiscal deficit ballooning and the implications of a downgrade, that the government was right to be cautious? Just that question. If that was the reason, was it right to be cautious?
If that was the reason, I don't accept it at all.
Why?
Because this is not business as usual. And leave aside for a minute the question of where to find the money. I'm the expert on that, and I've talked about it extensively. This year, economies will be judged in terms of their demonstrability of resilience. How resilient is India to the COVID shock? If income support, if the government was confident that income support that it gave would be delivered far more effectively than government programs normally are, then that would immediately have had a salutary effect on GDP. That salutary effect on GDP would have, for instance, provoked a rise in investment going forward. A combination of these things, when rating agencies looked at them, they would say this is a resilient economy. And therefore, the fiscal deficits that they have undertaken one shot, no one's expecting anyone to stick to any plans anywhere in the world now, were worth it. On the other hand, if the fiscal deficits were wasted by a weak government that was unable to deliver, then the rating agencies would punish us. So the whole thing turns upon the government's confidence in delivery. I do not think not meeting the debt target set or the deficit target set in the February budget are relevant. The February budget actually is completely irrelevant today.
Can I put it like this? Your entire answer seems to hinge upon the capacity of the government to use the fiscal deficit and deliver rather than waste the fiscal deficit. Let's assume the government is able to deliver rather than waste. On that assumption, you're saying the government was wrong not to have given a bigger stimulus, not to have boosted income, because that, as you said, and I'm quoting you, would have had a salutary impact on GDP. And if the GDP was growing, despite the fact the fiscal deficit was growing, agencies would have said this is a one-off, the economy is resilient, it is recovering, and they wouldn't have worried about the fiscal deficit.
But the government knows that its capacity to deliver is weak. So what you would expect to see in addition to, and the rating agencies know that, Karan. So in addition to providing this fiscal support, I've been saying this at the beginning, you've got to tell me what your 3-year spending battle plan is. What are you going to spend on? When do you see the results coming? With that kind of joined up strategic exercise, yes, fiscal support would have been possible. But just blindly throwing money out wouldn't have worked. And then the government, if the government was incapable and isn't capable of providing a 3-year battle plan, then it did the next best thing.
It's possible that the answer that you're looking for may have been hinted at, and the word is hinted at, in an article on the front page of the Times of India a few days ago, and in another article, I believe on the front page of the Economic Times today, the 20th of July. Both papers are suggesting that the government is considering an infrastructure-based boost that will be financed by A, monetizing the deficit, and B, by aggressive privatization. If that is the way the government chooses to finance a second stimulus, does it make sense to you?
You know, all this is becoming like what Gandhi said about Western civilization, that it would be a very good idea. How long does it take to build an airport in this country? How long does it take to build a railway line? When was the last time you heard of a project completed and finished on time, other than the Delhi Metro, which is hardly, a typical government project? Infrastructure projects carry on for years, and this is a very good illustration of what I'm saying. If magically the government was able to change the way it did business and deliver infrastructure, why you wouldn't need to privatize it all? But I haven't seen it in my lifetime. It takes 7 years to build an airport, it takes 9 years to build a road, infrastructure overruns exceed 40%. Now, if you're going to pretend that the reasons for those have magically disappeared, then yes, of course, this is a different country. Let's build airports in 6 months.
Are you saying from that answer that the government is actually proposing a stimulus in terms of infrastructure boost? It's a bad idea because India can't deliver infrastructure on time and this will not have an impact. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying if government wants to do an infrastructure boost, I need to know how it will do it differently from what it did last year, the year before, and 10 years before that. And I need a change in the way the government functions for the better, and then all these things work. Not in business as usual inefficiency.
And quite right. And since there's going to be no change in the way the government functions and delivers, therefore, an infrastructure boost is the wrong thing. It will be no different.
No, that's your opinion, not mine. I think the government is perfectly capable, if it wishes to change the way it functions, but it has to do that hard work.
All right.
And a lazy government will not do it.
You're beginning to go round in circles again, where you're not giving us
laziness is optional. Laziness is optional. In times of war, in times of drought relief, in times of disaster management, the government does change the way it functions.
Okay.
It's not that the government is incapable of doing it. It has to be willing to do it and work a little harder than it has shown a propensity to do. That's what I'm saying.
You're back to your favorite ploy of answering a question with another question and raising another subject. But I think
just answered it. There was going to be a mark there.
Let's not get back into this debating, because I think it's a waste of time. It may be enjoyable, but it doesn't take us anywhere. Let me come to another issue of great concern. A lot of the recovery, both from the virus and the lockdown, will happen at state level, but the problem is the states are strapped for cash. Pranab Sen said to me that in fact the states collectively could end up losing something up to 5 lakh crore. Now the government has permitted them to increase their borrowing from 3 to 5% to state GDP, but it's also attached stringent conditions. My question is simple. What do you make of the attitude of the central government to the states at this time of crisis?
Well, I'm so glad you asked me a question which doesn't say right, wrong. Because I'm not a moralizer or a soothsayer. I can say, can and will, or cannot and will not. So I can answer that question in what you would call non-speculative terms. I think this government has made a fundamental error in not being much more generous with supporting state finances. Why? Because many of the things that you have to do to deal with COVID, either to deal with COVID itself or its fallout, depends on substantially making sure that resources are not a constraint, and that constraint bites first at the state level. I have in my writing suggested several ways it could have done that, but for some mysterious reason, the government has elected to impose conditionalities, which perhaps reflects a lack of confidence in the state governments, which I think is highly misplaced. I think there is no metric on which you can say that central government spending is more efficient than state governments. I think there's every metric by which you can say that many state governments spend money far better than the center does. And every metric tells you that the expertise to spend money on stuff that matters, health, education, relief, etc., lies at the state level. And therefore, that should have been the locus where borrowed money should have been put in. I think it's very unfortunate it has not been. And for that matter, let me go back to income support. If income support were had to happen, it would need necessarily to happen through the state budgets and not through the center. Now, the politics of this I do not know and do not wish to comment on, but it is unambiguously true that I think it was a mistaken policy error to be so curmudgeonly with improving the conditions under which states get money. In fact, I would go further and say that the states should not even be asked to borrow. The borrowing that was, and I'll tell you why, for example. When the government prints money, for example, and borrows from the Reserve Bank of India, or when it uses what are called ways and means advances, which is it takes money from the Reserve Bank of India and pays interest on it, that interest goes into the profits of the Reserve Bank of India, and those profits of the Reserve Bank of India contribute to Government of India dividends. So what goes out comes back to Government of India. That's not true of the states. And therefore, I think it should have been possible to substantially increase interest-free financing to the states, and then you could have had conditions on what it should spend it on, and to be able to then further allow them to borrow on reasonable terms without the particular conditionalities that have been imposed. I hope that was unambiguous enough.
Very interesting in the middle of that fascinating answer that one of the possible reasons why income support was not a policy pursued by the government more vigorously is because income support would have to be channeled through state budgets, and that would have amounted to giving states more money, which clearly the government at the center has shied away from doing. That was a fascinating insight, which I think will help people understand why this government has opted not to stress on direct income support in a bigger way. Let me now, as we come to the end of part one, put a different sort of question to you. Many people say that an economic crisis in India is an ideal opportunity to push through economic reforms, particularly of the sort that the Indian system finds difficult to accept in normal times. A, would you agree? And if you do you have such reforms in mind?
I've never understood this proposition. I've never understood this proposition. Unless we are saying that India as a whole is an infantile country, which I refuse to believe. A crisis is a crisis, it's not an opportunity. And in resolving a crisis, I gave you an example earlier, sometimes you have to behave differently than what you were doing when the crisis happened. So if the government of India were able to raise its game in terms of efficiency and effectiveness because it had no choice, then the crisis would result in a change in behavior of the government of India. But that need not be permanent.
Okay.
That could well be temporary.
Do you have reforms that you could use this moment to push through?
Look, I have one very simple reform. It doesn't matter if you're in a crisis or not. You've got to stop thinking in 1 year bursts. And now I noticed at the beginning of this interview in 1 month bursts and 1 week bursts. That's a sign of an underconfident nation. I'm not telling the government, nation. A nation that does not know where it is going to be 3 years from now. The one thing we need now is a plan. We need a 3-year strategic plan. We know the economy is tanking. It's not our fault. It's tanking as a consequence of COVID. We know it has to recover, but we need to know where we're going to be in 3 years. We don't need some rhetorical statement saying India is going to be the 3rd greatest economy in Asia in 3 years. That plan is not forthcoming. It is not forthcoming from government. It is not forthcoming from industry. It is not forthcoming from anywhere else. So unless we have as a nation a plan of how we are going to get from here to where we want to be in 2025, and the crisis makes that even more urgent, given the fact that we were already growing very slowly before this crisis, we are going to be in very bad shape collectively.
You've made a very cogent argument that we need a 3-year, maybe even a 5-year plan, and it's not forthcoming from government. Why is it not forthcoming from government? You've been on the inside as a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. I'm asking a blunt question. You may not want to answer it. Does the government have the right sort of advisors, economists, planners to be able to devise this plan? Or is that the problem? That the people advising the government don't think along these lines?
India has the necessary capacity to develop such a plan. The government chooses the advisors that it wishes to choose.
Do you want to elaborate on that?
What is there to elaborate? India has the advisors to be able to execute this plan in all its dimensions. It always has. The government chooses the advisors it wishes to choose.
In other words, and I'm repeating this because I think it's a very important but subtly expressed answer that needs to be perhaps made a little clearer for the audience. We have the advisors to do the planning. We have the advisors to give the right advice, but the government chooses the advisors it wishes to choose. That suggests that it hasn't chosen advisors that can give the right advice. I know that last is my conclusion, but it flows and follows from what you said.
Possibly.
It must be. That we have to do. I'm going to take a break at that point. I know I'm not going to get more out of you. You've been very deft. You've been very diplomatic. I'm going to come back. And in the limited time in part 2, I'm going to talk to you about yourself. Let's see if we can get some understanding of your deftness and your rather ambiguous answers at times from part 2. First, a little break. Welcome back to a special interview for The Wire. My guest is the Director of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy and a former member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Rathin Roy. Dr. Roy, let's talk about yourself. You've resigned as Director of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. Why? Why have you given up the job?
Well, one reason is that as you head into your second term, and given my age, I'm in my early 50s, I have a time-bound term limit. The possibility of finding a job at the age of, in your early 50s is about as late as in your mid-20s. Because then you are underqualified, now you're overqualified. So you start looking relatively early. And then I did find some interesting things to come. The other, I think, is that there is a fundamental existential question that publicly supported research think tanks like NIPFP are grappling with, which is, does government still believe that there is merit in funding independent research as opposed to training bipartisan research, but independent research, as opposed to training, event management, and other like things. And that conversation, I think, has become somewhat ambivalent since the last Expenditure Management Commission submitted its report, because there is an urge at one level to ask such institutions to become autonomous. And that is very difficult for a public finance institution like NIPFP. The metrics by which you judge a public finance institution like NIPFP have to be, is the research good? Is it globally recognized? And so far, I'd like to think that NIPFP has. But if you then want to add that self-sufficiency,
let me pick up what you said. You said, does the government believe in funding independent research? What's your answer? Do you think this government prefers research that is in line with its thinking rather than research which questions or even goes further and criticizes its thinking?
No, I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is that, in principle, government regards institutions as institutions that should do research that is not immediately, something that is commissioned for policy, which is short, sharp bits of work, or whether it thinks it should be training, etc., and whether institutions should be self-sufficient or not.
Let me put this
because there's a contradiction between the two.
Let me put this to you. Till last year, you were a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Then he chose, for whatever reason, to drop you when he reconstituted the council after the election. You've now resigned from the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, which is a government-funded body. Do you have problems with the government? Does that lie behind your decision to resign?
No, I wouldn't use the word problems. It is that the negotiation process with government and is not one where aims and objectives are necessarily automatically shared. And that is not just true of NIPFP, and that's not just true of this government. So every director has to spend a lot of time doing that. I've been doing it for 7 years, both with this government and the previous one. 7 years is a long time, and I think now fresh energy is needed to continue that conversation. That conversation does happen.
You talk about the negotiation process with the government not being easy, sometimes being torturous. There were reports that the government was upset with an article you wrote for the Business Standard immediately after Nirmala Sitharaman's first budget in July last year, where you questioned her revenue and expenditure figures and showed that the calculation was possibly incorrect. There are also reports that the government was unhappy with interviews you gave NDTV, interviews that you gave The Wire. Is there any truth to that?
When we speak of government in this context, Karan, it's wise not to speak of the monolith. So if your question is, were some people unhappy in the first case when I said it like it is? The answer is unquestionably yes. Those people I don't think are in government anymore. But the bureaucracy, in my view, not individuals, they're very good individuals, the bureaucracy. But as an asset class, the bureaucracy has become more and more wary of external inputs that might cause their political masters to understand that perhaps things are not all that well. And that would be, and then the bureaucracy uses certain notions or biases to cast doubt on the independence or the autonomy of an analytical judgment that is drawn. I have never, and you saw that in the first part of the interview, I dislike using words like right or wrong. I never criticize personalities, I always speak on issues. But when you speak on issues, and if those issues have arisen possibly as a consequence of inattention or even worse, incompetence, then there would be ramifications, and the bureaucracy as a system is very close, is very quick to close in on that. I think something of that.
Can I go back to that article you wrote for the Business Standard immediately after Nirmala Sitharaman's first budget in July last year, where you quite correctly questioned her revenue and expenditure figures? You said some people were unquestionably unhappy with that article. You also added they're not in government anymore. And you then went on to talk about the bureaucracy and how the bureaucracy doesn't like external inputs that somehow question what the government is doing. Was it the finance secretary of the time that criticized that article and expressed his unhappiness?
I never comment on personalities.
But it was a bureaucrat, that is for sure. Or was it a minister?
That's again a personality-based question, so I excuse myself.
But your suggestion that answer could be either. It might even have been both.
Or maybe I don't even know. I do know the fact that there was some disquiet, but I don't know the precise quarters where that came from. What I heard through hearsay, and I tend not to repeat hearsay.
But you were clearly told that the system, let me use that word to cover both bureaucrats and politicians, the system was not happy with your Business Standard article calling into question Nirmala Sitharaman's figures in her first budget. The system...
No, I don't think the system in terms of the permanent workaday system, yes. I do not think that is automatically true of the political authorities. They may have thought one way at some point, but when the correctness of my case became clear, then I think they had to take cognizance. That being said, I can tell you
but yes, no doubt. When the correctness of your criticism became clear, no doubt they had to take cognizance of what you've written, but that would have embarrassed them even more for two reasons. A, it would have meant that their unhappiness was unjustified. And secondly, it would have meant you pointed out something they'd done wrong. So on both counts, they wouldn't have been happy with you.
I don't think the second is true because, as I said, the government is not a monolith. And the political establishment has to work on the best advice given by the bureaucratic system.
Did any bureaucrat at the time turn around and say to you, well done, Rathin, that article was a very good one. I'm so glad you've written it. Did anyone praise you?
No.
That answers my question. One more question about stories of your disagreement with the government. The government in that first budget in July proposed sovereign borrowing abroad. It said that you were opposed to it. Did that create friction between you and the finance ministry or the finance minister?
Not with the finance minister, but certainly with the finance ministry. But that was something far too important to be left to the use of coercive power and ran through. I think that the decision to go for sovereign bonds was wrong-headed. It was a mistake and it exposed the country very gravely to external risk. I therefore tried to mobilize public opinion and went up to the highest levels, not just of government, but its intellectual base to make my case. And I found that the ears were open and I had to give the government the space to withdraw from doing it without actually making a statement. And I'm very happy to say that's one of my achievements, that my arguments I was able to put through at the political level. And as a consequence of which today, India is not in the business of sovereign dollar or foreign currency denominated bonds. And if there's one thing I've done to protect the country, and where I played a small part, I think it is this.
You're actually claiming credit for the fact that the sovereign bond proposal didn't go any further. And I'm sure you're right. But there's something you said in that answer that I want to pick up on. Your words were, I went up to the highest level of not just the government. When you say not just the government, are you hinting that you actually spoke directly to the PM?
PM is part of the government.
But you said not just the government. You went up to the highest level of not just the government. That means you went up to the highest level of the government as well. Therefore, I asked, did you speak to the PM?
I did go up to the highest level of government in writing, and I could do so at that point.
So you wrote to the PM?
I wrote to the Prime Minister's office on this, and in fact, if you'd like to know about the fiscal crisis as well, summarizing my concerns. I could not write before the budget because I was not privy to the documents. But shortly after the government, after the budget, yes, I did. And I have every reason to believe that it was conveyed.
And you have reason to believe that it was because of you that the government let that proposal for sovereign bonds?
No, not me. There was a collective of public opinion, ranging from former governors and others. Okay. I just think I did my bit by perhaps alerting a certain intellectual space beyond the highest levels of government, that this would not be something that a nationalist government ought to be contemplating. And that did work.
One other thing, whilst you were director, and you are in fact going to continue till the end of August, were you ever told, don't criticize the government, its policies, or its budget in public? And secondly, were you ever told, do not give interviews to organizations in the media that are critical of the government?
On the first, I must clarify, I was never told that directly.
What about
indirectly, a lot of people, including the media, would tell me things that caused me some amusement and also some wonder. I would say something perfectly commonplace that is true, that for example, that the government has for the last 5 years not been able to get to the disinvestment targets it has set itself. And people in the private sector, in the media would say, you're very courageous. I don't understand what's so courageous about that.
No, no, just
It's a
more.
fact.
I'm not talking about independent people in the private sector. Did anyone in government ever say, don't be critical of the government? And secondly, did anyone in government ever say, don't give interviews to elements of the media that are often critical of the government?
On the first round question, directly never. On the second, ex post, it was conveyed to me sometimes that the particular outlet I spoke to was not one which would gather me many sort of affirmative laurels in government.
And on the first, you said directly never. I'm intrigued
Never.
by that word. You use words very precisely. Indirectly, possibly it may have happened even on the first.
In this city, there is an ecosystem which prides itself on closeness to government. I have no means of knowing whether they're close to government or not. So in that ecosystem, people would come and whisper in my ear and say X is not happy or Y is not happy, but I have never been formally told that what I was doing was either inappropriate or was not something the government found acceptable.
Just so that there's no confusion, you were never told directly, don't criticize the government, but you were often conveyed that there are some institutions in the media that it would be best not to talk to.
Yes, that conveyance was done, but it was done third hand or second hand, as often happens in government. So I'm no means of knowing whether that person was making it up or whether there was some credibility in the high of sort of sources that that person alluded to and claimed to have the confidence of. I have simply no idea.
Absolutely, I understand that. All I'll point out is that there was a time when you were fairly frequent on NDTV in The Wire, and there's been a long gap since then, and I'm delighted you're back with us again today. But that gap, the audience can judge for themselves. I won't pass any comment on it, nor invite you to do so either. My last question. You're taking up a job with the Overseas Development Institute, better known by its initials ODI in London. You will be one of its two managing directors. Is it just a coincidence that you're leaving India and you're going to be living in Britain for the next few years?
I didn't get that, I'm sorry.
Is it just a coincidence that you're leaving India and will be living in Britain for the next few years?
Yeah, well, before I answer that, let me point out to you that empirically you're wrong. I have given more interviews to you, Karan, than I have to anyone else I know, and that is because I enjoy doing interviews.
And I thank you. I thank you. I thank you. Although you and I know there's been a gap of about 6-8 months since I last had the pleasure of talking to you. I'm not.
There is no other interviewer who I've spoken to with greater frequency than I've spoken to you. So just to set that record straight, 1-to-1. Not even CNBC, which would be my normal, turf of lead. Now, on the second question, it is not a coincidence in the sense that I'll be very honest with you. I'd like to stay on in India, but because I'm in my early 50s and therefore I'm overqualified for many jobs and it's COVID, I simply have not found any employment that I could possibly have undertaken that would be satisfactory. And therefore, it is with great reluctance that I leave India. It is with great anticipation that I'm going to this world-class think tank ODI. I've known them for 30 years. I have a lot of respect for them. I'm hoping that I will be able to think, write, and read, not least for your viewers' complete book, I think, for me, that is rather important that I'm writing on the Indian economy and where it is going. It's a political economy book. So I'm glad I'm back in the world of ideas and not directly in the world of policy for a few years. And certainly I hope if somebody will have me to come back recharged someday, I'm always available to serve my country in any capacity. And I'd like to make that very clear. I'm in
India. You would be available if, to your surprise and mine, the government were to ring up in a year's time or two and say, Rathin, we need you as chief economic advisor.
I don't know about the precise job, the post, but if there is a job to be done, and either the government or the private sector or anybody else thinks that the job is an important one in the national interest, I will do it.
That's very, very clear. Dr. Roy, I wish you good luck in London. It's a magnificent city you're going to. I know you'll enjoy it enormously. In the meanwhile, thank you for this interview. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.